In 1963, an American expedition did something never before achieved. They filmed from the summit of Mount Everest.
Before them is a sight to lift the heart and bring tears to the eyes. These are the first moving pictures ever taken from the summit of Everest.
Narrated by Orson Welles, this film was the first time the world saw the view from its tallest mountain. But these cameras were also capturing something else. The final chapter in the conquest not only of Everest, but all the Himalayas' great peaks. This was the epic era of mountaineering. An era when filmmakers helped turn mountaineering into a global struggle for prestige.
There was this sense that there was an international race going on.
Nothing was more important than those mountains.
Between the 1920s and the 1960s, the highest mountains on Earth became symbols of status and achievement.
So kommen im Kampf die Hochgipfel die vornehmsten Mannestugenden zum Einsatz.
This was really mountaineering as politics.
The largest expeditions ever assembled became displays of national power.
The expeditions themselves were branded with empire.
From the beginning, filmmakers risked everything to capture these great spectacles.
This was something that nobody had done before, to climb up to those levels and film under extreme conditions.
And their films didn't just immortalize these historic expeditions, but helped inspire and finance them in an era when the great peaks became great propaganda. The epic era of mountaineering required an epic stage. The Himalayas, a mountain range on a scale unmatched anywhere.
It's a great arc of mountains stretching for over 1,500 miles, all the way from Afghanistan in the west to Burma in the east. It's just on a colossal scale.
The world's 14 highest mountains are all in the Himalayas, the only peaks on the planet that reach over 8,000 meters. In 1913, a British army officer and filmmaker called John Noel gazed from Darjeeling in India towards these distant peaks. He dreamed of seeing one in particular, the tallest, Everest. Everest had been measured from afar by the British in 1856.
And such was a wizardry of differential calculus and mathematics that they could literally peer across the skyline to the peaks that scored the horizon, and from considerable distances come up with astonishingly accurate measurements of their height. Once they discovered that this was the tallest mountain in the world, I mean, it captured the imagination.
But before Noel, no one had been within 40 miles of the mountain. Because while the British could see it, they could not approach it. Everest wasn't just shielded by the vast Himalayan range, but by the two nations on whose borders it sat, Nepal to the south and Tibet to the north. These were nations caught between the great powers of their day, the British Raj, China, and the Russian Empire. To survive, both Tibet and Nepal had isolated themselves to outside influence.
Throughout the 19th century, people have been trying to get to Tibet. Explorers, travellers, scholars, soldiers, missionaries, colonial officers. And effectively Tibet had been closed to outsiders.
None of which was going to stop John Noel. In 1913, Noel disguised himself as a pilgrim and crossed illegally into Tibet with two companions, determined to photograph a route to Everest. He was about to set in motion the epic era of mountaineering.
This is a photograph of my father in 1913 in the disguise that he adopted to go to Mount Everest, and he had this coat made. In his case, he had to blacken his face with boot polish in order to effect a better disguise. He realized that he was going to have to avoid habitation because he didn't want to be seen. And so he had chosen this rather slightly obscure route, and he's written down here that this was an unguarded pass which has hitherto never been explored by a white man.
He was incredibly courageous, you know. I mean, you read his packing list: disassembled rifles, a revolver, automatic pistols. There's no doubt about it. They knew what kind of welcome they were going to get.
Noel's photographs chart an 8-week odyssey. He was the first Westerner to come within 40 miles of the mountain.
And he got close enough to see that there was a series of ridges still between him and Everest, but no one had gotten that close.
But he had also been spotted by local militia.
And they fired a shot at in my father's direction, and they didn't realise that A, he was well supplied with arms, and that also he was a very fine shot. And so when he launched a shot, they disappeared rather quickly.
His cover blown, Noel's journey was over. But he had proved that Everest could be reached.
The initial scheme of going to Everest, this was very much the creation of John Noel before the First World War.
Having photographed a route to the mountain, next Noel would help inspire the first ever expedition to climb it and film it. In 1919, 5 months after the end of the First World War, John Noel addressed a meeting of the Royal Geographical Society in London.
It's very modern, you know, lantern slides and a smoky room. He approaches the podium. There's cigar smoke all over the place.
Noel projected slides of his journey to Everest, captured 6 years earlier.
And so Noel began his talk saying that had it not been for the war, Everest would have been achieved, and we must achieve it in the wake of the war. And everybody erupted in applause.
Noel's audience was filled with veterans of the war.
You can't understand who these men were without factoring in the reality that they spent 4 years and 4 months eye deep in hell in the blood, mud, and agony of the Western Front.
To men jaded by years of industrialized warfare, Everest had new meaning.
By then, the mountains almost become a symbol of regeneration for a nation bled white by the war. His presentation is a huge hit. It all begins with that incredible evening in March of 1919.
Following Noel's address, a mission to climb Everest was proposed. An Everest committee was formed, and in 1922, the first great expedition of the epic era of mountaineering departed from northern India. Filming it is the man who had inspired it, John Noel. This expedition carries all the hallmarks of the epic era of mountaineering to come. The first is its huge scale. Over 300 pack animals and 100 Sherpa porters recruited from Nepal carry several tons of supplies. The second hallmark is the expedition's military structure. In command is General Charles Bruce. He and the other 13 British, Noel included, had all served in the First World War.
Military guys understand logistics. They understand moving materials from A to B and fighting a campaign.
There was a symbiotic relationship between the army and the climbing community.
The third hallmark is that this is no leisure pursuit. The expedition's scale and lofty goal means that national prestige is at stake.
How it was presented to the public was very much as a kind of expression of national will and ability, and this will bring glory to the nation.
The expeditions themselves were branded with empire.
Nearly 2 weeks after leaving Darjeeling, the expedition enters Tibet. Passage to the mountain had been secured in return for British aid in Tibet's simmering conflict with China.
The final permission to go into Tibet was part of an arms deal. So Everest was never divorced from the geopolitical ebb and flow of empire. It was always integral to it.
No one has ever filmed in Tibet before Noel. His camera captures the first moving images the Western world will see of this hidden land.
It's the first time that a film was made in Tibet, and it's the first really ethnographic film, or a film about the people of Tibet.
It is a deeply feudal society. A third of the people are in monasteries or nunneries. It is, life expectancy is not good. There is no education. It's basic.
It's not just the aristocracy that's filmed. He films the man in the street who comes up to look at the camera and smiles. The women out in their tents churning milk who are obviously embarrassed by the camera. I think it's delightful to have captured those kind of images.
As the landscape becomes more alien, so does the culture. At the final monastery before the mountain, Noel films a religious festival. Dancers wear suits of human bones and play drums of human skin. Most of Noel's film of this expedition is of the journey through Tibet and its culture. Because the filming of the mountain, like the climbing of it, would prove harder than anyone could have imagined.
It was the moonshot of the 1920s. They were going somewhere. They didn't even know whether they could survive there. They didn't know whether they could breathe. It was just so beyond ordinary human experience.
As the expedition heads into the unknown, Everest appears on film for the first time. Base camp is established at nearly 5,500 meters. Above even the tallest peak of Europe, Noel sets up the world's highest ever photographic laboratory.
He has a tent for developing his films that he sets up by the side of a glacial stream. His film and negative are sort of cracking brittle in the frozen temperatures.
It was a nightmarish proposition because, the developers would freeze in the cold, dust would enter the tent and ruin emulsions.
He sets up a wee little stove fueled by yak dung to try and dry out his negatives.
He was a truly original photographer and filmmaker. Nothing escaped his imagination.
Fighting altitude sickness, Noel shoots and processes 10,000 feet of film. 2 attempts are made on the summit. Noel can only film them disappearing up the vast slopes. Out of his camera's range, each party sets new altitude records. But these are conditions no man has before experienced. Noel films the 2 defeated teams returning.
Basically, the camp is too low. They give it a good try, but they are just not in the right place with the right stuff at the right time.
With the monsoon approaching, the expedition retreats from the mountain and the long journey back to Britain begins. In London, Noel's film accompanied the climbers' lecture tour and was not widely seen. Everest remained unclimbed, but the expedition hadn't been for nothing.
In many ways, it was a good first attempt. You talk about failure. Well, they didn't do it, but they learned a great deal.
The mountain hadn't been climbed, but there was a strong sense that we've got to give the Everest Committee £8,000, and in doing so, also relieve them of the obligation of paying for the photographic work, which is essentially another contribution of £2,000, so £10,000.
That's entrepreneurial brilliance, and it saves the RGS's bacon, because they need the cash. This is very expensive. It puts them back in the field.
The same filmmaker who had inspired the first ever Everest expedition was now single-handedly financing the second. The expedition enters Tibet in 1924, along the same route as its predecessor. Expectations are high, not just among the climbers, but the British public.
If you look at the amount of coverage in the Times and the newspapers, it's really remarkable, given everything else that was going on in the world. There was a total expectation of success.
At base camp, Noel shoots a portrait of the climbers.
He was actually quite aware that many of the climbers didn't really want a filmmaker on the expedition. So actually Noel is quite discreet. He's sensitive to the explorers' needs.
One figure finds his way to the centre of the lineup. This is George Mallory, second in command of the expedition and the finest British climber of the age.
Mallory famously said, "This isn't Hollywood, why do we need a filmmaker?"
Filming was seen as kind of an unnecessary vulgarity. They didn't want a cameraman interfering with the climbers.
What the climbers did not know was that Noel's film was going to change the course of mountaineering history. As the expedition prepares for the climb, Noel begins putting into practice the lessons learned from 1922.
He realized that there was no way you could develop film on the mountain. So he did the extraordinary. He bought land in Darjeeling, he built a photographic studio, and he arranged a relay system.
So he's sending back his film on sort of runners and on yaks to have this footage developed and processed.
Without having to develop overnight, now Noel can concentrate exclusively on his cinematography. He uses coloured tinting to create atmosphere as the men struggle across jagged glacial ice.
I really think he has captured the enormity of it, the desolation. I think with the tinting, it's given us a very good impression of the temperature. I can feel it, chilly.
There's artistry in this film. It's shots of high-speed winds on the ridges of mountains catching the clouds. There are shots of sunlight moving across the surface of glaciers that are just magic to watch.
Noel has with him 14 cameras. Here he demonstrates his primary cine camera. It features several of his own innovations. Electric motors allow both time-lapse and slow motion. Rubber casing prevents freezing. Adjustments reduce static electricity that can damage the film.
If you look at his film technique itself, he pioneered in so many ways his use of lenses, his use of slow motion, his use of aperture.
All of these techniques that hadn't yet been used, certainly not in the Himalayas.
Perhaps the greatest feat of filmmaking of its day was about to unfold. Noel climbs with his cameras to around 6,700 meters, the third of 6 camps, and the limit of his endurance. Here he locates a ridge to film the final summit teams.
That's my father with one of his porters looking for a suitable place to position the cameras.
No one has ever filmed before at these altitudes.
He said on occasions he was so cold and so numb that he couldn't even think, let alone try and manipulate the cameras.
Noel switches to his customized telephoto lens. What all of Britain hopes will be the ascent of Everest is about to begin. 2 climbers, Somerville and Norton, depart with their porters to the higher camps for the first summit attempt. At nearly 2 miles distant, no one has ever filmed at this range before. As the climbers recede into distant specks, Everest moves to center stage.
And the star of the film is the mountain. This kind of elemental colossus that's constantly just outside the tent. I mean, that's the great brilliance of this film, is that you begin to understand the scale of the objective, and you're an increasingly weak and ill and uncertain creature in front of it.
Norton and Somerville return 2 days later, lucky to be alive. Snow-blind and in agony, Norton is carried to his tent. Now the final assault begins. From afar, Noel films George Mallory and his climbing partner Sandy Irvine as they depart with their porters. Using bottled oxygen, they are about to climb higher than any human before them.
You can hardly see the men, they're like little ants, aren't they?
You just see them at a distance, incredibly fragile against this backdrop that, they're gone.
But now you can even begin to see in this footage the mist rolling in across the northeast ridge.
Nobody knew whether it was even physically possible for Mallory and Irvine to reach the summit.
The drive to climb these peaks for the first time there was pushing men way beyond the limits of perhaps what was sensible. Medicine just didn't know what was going to happen.
But perhaps Mallory's sense of risk had been shaped by his years spent on the Western Front.
In a sense, for that whole generation, it's an obvious reality that the war was the backdrop of their lives. At some level, they had seen so much of death that it had no hold on them. I think life mattered less than the moments of being alive. And I think that is how they were able to accept a level of risk that actually Everest demanded.
Dawn brings no news of Mallory and Irvine. Noel and his porters scan the peak for any sign of the men. A search party is sent to the highest camp. Noel's camera captures the extraordinary scenes that unfold.
For me, the most powerful sequence in the film is when they're waiting at a lower camp, waiting for men to return. And we see tiny little figures assembling blankets in the form of a cross.
The figures are the search party, and the cross is a prearranged signal.
A symbol for, effectively all hope is lost. The men have died, there's no hope of rescue.
Well, there's one figure staying by the he's just slumped down in the snow. God, this is heartbreaking.
It's very moving to see this, even almost 100 years later, as the moment where people knew finally that no one else was coming down.
It must have been a crushing blow for Noel behind the camera, who'd invested this money in taking a film of this expedition, and all of a sudden he's behind the camera thinking, oh no, tragedy's happened.
Noel then films Sherpas laying out a responding message to the search party above.
So it's 6 blankets laid in threes, rows of blankets, the message, abandon all hope, come on down. And it's like they're laying out bodies in the snow, these blankets. It's beautiful, it's moving, it's terrible.
Mallory's body was found in 1999. Irvine's remains on the mountain. It's unknown whether they reached the summit. The great Everest expedition of 1924, so certain of success, has ended in tragedy. Noel's hopes of being the man to film the climbing of Everest are dashed. Looming large is the massive £10,000 outlay that needs recouping.
The pressure on him to make a successful film, particularly in 1924, was intense. He had to recoup that investment, and he had to have a hit. The challenge for Noel is that the expectation is victory, and the reality is death. His story has gone from being this incredible epic success to being a eulogy for the death of Mallory and Irvine. He's fretful. Is it going to be successful?
To make back the money, Noel hit upon an extraordinary way to publicize the film.
He comes up with a scheme to get 7 monks to come out and accompany the film at its opening.
Here you have Tibetan monks who look glorious, playing tunes on human thigh bones. How could you not want to see that?
The so-called dancing llamas that accompanied Noel's film were the talk of Britain. But news of this stunt, together with some of the scenes depicted in the film, was not received well in Tibet.
The Tibetans are furious. These monks have been reduced in their mind to a carnival show. The religion's been insulted. This affair of the dancing llamas so offended the Tibetans that they refused any permission for future expeditions into Tibet.
Thanks to Noel's film and its publicity, the British would be denied further access to Everest for nearly a decade. When Tibet readmitted Britain in 1933, they found the Himalayan game had changed.
The great problem for the Mount Everest Committee in the 30s is that other people, other countries, damn them, have shown up on the scene wanting to climb the Himalayan giant. There's lots of interest from Germany and Austria. There's interest from America. They want to come and play as well.
Nazi Germany launched its first large-scale expedition to the Himalayas in 1934. Its target was Nanga Parbat, the 9th highest of the 8,000-meter peaks in what is modern-day Pakistan. The expedition was financed by the Nazi state. The film, introduced by the Nazi Reichssportführer, left no doubt why they were here.
Der Kampf den Himalaya ist der verkörperte Wille des Menschen, die Materie zu besiegen.
They are there in order to further the standing of the German nation, driven by a sense of competition with the other great mountaineering nations, first and foremost the British.
German mountaineers had come to believe that they could elevate their nation's status during the disastrous aftermath of the First World War.
To the Germans, the First World War left a deeper imprint on their mountaineering practice than it had even for the British.
And mountaineering is clearly seen as a tool to regain German standing as a nation. And it becomes official policy of the German and Austrian Alpine Association.
The German and Austrian Alpine Association soon aligned itself with Germany's rising right wing.
A Jewish section is expelled from the German Alpine Club in the early 1920s. These are sort of proto-Nazi policies. So it becomes associated with fascist politics early on.
In the 1920s, Germany and Austria were home to the biggest climbing club in the world. This explosion in mountaineering's popularity saw a new genre of film flourish called Bergfilm, or mountain films. The Holy Mountain was one of these films. Tales of heroism and love set against the Alps. It wasn't long before Bergfilm was also drawn into the Nazi sphere. The Holy Mountain was notable for the debut of its female star, Leni Riefenstahl. Riefenstahl was a former dancer who became a leading lady in Bergfilm in the 20s and 30s. In 1932, she directed her first mountain film, The Blue Light. Riefenstahl's film, like others in the genre, used striking imagery to hint at a greater struggle than simply man against mountain.
The imagery of mountaineering is a really powerful thing, and Riefenstahl, I think, really nailed that.
Among the Blue Light's many admirers was Germany's new Reichschancellor, Adolf Hitler. Hitler employed Riefenstahl to film the Nazi rallies at Nuremberg. He also had her film the 1936 Berlin Olympics, the great showcase of Nazi values. Her balletic celebration of the physical form harked back to the dancing sequences of her mountain films.
The quality of her work in the Olympics arose from her experience gained in the Berg film. I mean, I think the two are intimately linked. I mean, you can't have the one without the other.
It was at the Olympics that the Nazi takeover of German mountaineering and mountain film was made complete. Joining Riefenstahl's film was the premiere of the Nanga Parbat expedition documentary. The expedition had been a disaster, with 10 killed in storms. Their deaths are presented as heroic sacrifices for the fatherland. Coffins are shown wrapped in swastikas. And the Nazi Reichssportsführer provides his stirring epitaph.
So kommen im Kampf die Hochgipfel die vornehmsten Mannestugenden zum Einsatz. Einordnung in den militärischen Geist der Gemeinschaftsleistung, Kameradschaft, Kampfesmut, lose Hingabe an das Ziel.
The Germans weren't alone in harnessing the symbolic power of the Himalayas. A group of Britons, fearful of Nazi expansion, were about to turn Everest into the star of perhaps the greatest publicity stunt of the 1930s. In 1933, a camera crew films a British expedition to Everest arriving at Karachi, India. But this is not mountaineering equipment being unloaded. They were aircraft. And they were part of an audacious plan to be the first to fly over the summit of Mount Everest.
The absolute crest, the pinnacle of the world, the last mystery, Blacker. Well, do realize you could put Everest on the map in 3 hours.
The film portrayed the driving force behind the adventure as British pluck and daring do. But forget the pluck. This was propaganda. The expedition was led by RAF officer Air Commodore Peregrine Fellows,
Start this year. There's not much time.
a man who had become fearful of the rapidly expanding Nazi Luftwaffe.
My great-uncle Peregrine had always been interested in the development of flight, and he felt very, very strongly that we were in danger of going into a war with Germany totally unprepared in terms of air power.
This flight over Everest was to be a PR stunt for the Royal Air Force.
It was a romantic practical purpose. It was to catch the imagination of the public. They thought that, Everest had always been the great sort of challenge to man.
The costs were huge, around £1.2 million today. This finance came from private backers, with a stipulation that would cause the pilots great discomfort: that they cooperate fully with the 7-strong camera crew.
There's quite a few tales about the way the filmmakers imposed themselves upon the whole business.
£40 under guarantee. Splendid.
Here's poor old Pell having to act enthusiasm on the telephone. You can sort of see what agony he was in, can't you, really? He couldn't stand publicity. He absolutely hated it.
The filmmakers shadowed the pilots as they crossed India to their final base south of Nepal. 2 customized aircraft based on cutting-edge British technology set off to attempt a record-breaking flight.
That they hated doing. When they were all waving their hats, it was absolutely ghastly. Of course, the Englishmen, you can imagine. More enthusiasm, chaps, come on!
While Air Commodore Fellows awaited news from the ground, McIntyre piloted the second aircraft. What these men were doing had the ring of a suicide mission. To save weight, they would not be carrying parachutes.
Even if you bailed out, nobody would know where you were. There was no communication.
A mad exploit, going up in an open cockpit plane in a heated suit. It should never have worked, it was mad.
The vicious air currents the planes hit above the Himalayas are captured in the jolting camera work.
As they were approaching Everest and the southern flanks of Everest, they found themselves caught in this tremendous downdraft.
McIntyre's aircraft was nearly dashed on the mountainside, barely cresting Everest's southern ridge.
He describes the event as experiencing a terrific bump, like passing over an explosives factory when it explodes.
The other aircraft made it over the summit and got the crucial shots.
How extraordinary must that have been, knowing that no human being had ever seen this sight? None of the climbers, nobody, had ever seen Everest from this angle. I mean, it's really unbelievable.
Both aircraft returned unscathed.
Did you get there? What did it like? All right.
The film, eventually called Wings Over Everest, was a huge success and would win an Oscar. For Air Commodore Fellows, the real success would be evident when Britain would have to fight its war years later.
It did achieve its goal. I mean, after that, investment in air power did change substantially over the next few years. And we did have a fighting air force by the time war was declared.
But there was another aspect to the Everest flight that makes it central to the epic era of mountaineering. As well as the film they shot, the pilots took extensive aerial photographs of the unknown southern approaches to the mountain. As we shall see, in time these photographs would be vital in planning a route by which the mountain could be climbed. For the rest of the 1930s, however, while Britain had captured Everest from the air, it could not conquer it from the ground. Expeditions to Everest in 1933 and 1936 ended in failure. These were smaller affairs than the great expeditions of the 1920s. Neither had official cameramen. Interest at home was fading. The Germans returned twice more to Nanga Parbat. Even with Luftwaffe supply drops, these expeditions also failed. But the films made of them continued to serve Nazi propaganda. In 1938, a final pre-war British expedition to Everest joined the other British efforts of the decade in failure.
These were all truly dreadful failures, long forgotten and overlooked expeditions, but in a way they had become symbols of the impotence of England and Britain on the eve of Hitler's war.
As war broke out, Everest and the Himalayas' other 8,000-meter peaks remained unclimbed. Europe's climbing elite was drafted into specialist mountain units to fight from the Alps to the Caucasus. The violence didn't reach the Himalayas. But when the fighting stopped, the quest for the so-called 8,000ers would become a race.
The whole political map changes, absolutely fundamentally, in all kinds of ways.
In 1947, India and Pakistan were granted independence by a Britain weakened by war. In 1950, the Chinese invaded Tibet, forcing Nepal to open up for the first time.
And they said, all right, well, we will open our doors to the West. Nepal didn't want to be swallowed up by China or India.
From now on, the British would have no control over who could climb in what was once their Raj. The 14 8,000-meter peaks were open for business to all comers. And in 1950, a French expedition became the first to climb an 8,000-meter peak, Annapurna. By climbing the 10th highest of the 8,000ers, a psychological barrier had been broken.
The first ascent of an 8,000-meter peak was a kind of signal that, you know, it was possible to get to the top of big mountains. But what nobody had achieved before the war was now starting to happen.
There is a fundamental understanding that these things are going to be climbed, and soon, and if you don't get on with it, you're going to miss out.
French success on Annapurna was especially alarming for the British. Nepal hadn't just opened up a route to Annapurna, but to the southern slopes of Everest. With Tibet occupied, this was now the only way to reach the mountain. And in 1952, the unthinkable happened. The Nepalese granted access to Everest to a Swiss expedition. The film the Swiss made highlighted the expertise of their climbers.
Whereas most of the nations of Europe were fighting each other during the Second World War, the Swiss were neutral. So there was a lot more climbing going on in Switzerland than anywhere else.
And the Swiss nearly did it. They nearly did it. They got to 8,500 meters. A mere 300 meters. God, they were so close. It would have been utter dismay that they thought that the Swiss might gazump the Brits, their mountain.
Britain secured a permit to attempt Everest through Nepal the following year. The competition to climb the mountain was entering overdrive.
There was this sense that there was an international race going on for who could get up Everest. The Nepalese government was giving permission for one country each year to have a go. In 1952 it was the Swiss, in 1953 it was the British, in 1954 it was going to be the French, in 1955 it might have been the Americans or the Swiss. There were requests coming in from all over the world.
As the British planned their 1953 expedition, they knew it was now or never. The pressure was intense on the expedition leader, John Hunt, another military man.
He was a sort of army officer who was at that point working for Montgomery in France. You know, he'd been through the war. He was a very, very successful soldier. He understood logistics. An army marches on its stomach.
He accepted hook, line and sinker the notion that we've got to get to the summit by whatever means are necessary to get there.
Hunt used the film and photography taken by the Wings Over Everest pilots in 1933 to help plan the route up Everest's southern flanks. A cameraman records the expedition's journey to base camp. But this ascent would be filmed differently to those before. As the climbers progress higher on the mountain, one of them, George Lowe, becomes chief cameraman.
He was given a little camera, it's called a gun camera. These sort of robust cameras that were actually developed in the war, attached to the wings of fighter planes, trained on machine guns so they could sort of record footage.
In George Lowe's hands, these lightweight gun cameras mean for the first time filming can take place on the higher reaches of the mountain. At around 7,500 meters up, the expedition meets its greatest challenge, the Lhotse face, a 1,200-meter slope of ice. Hunt plans to haul nearly a ton of supplies up this frozen face to support his final assault teams. George Lowe and his team are tasked with cutting the steps the porters will follow.
Getting up the Lhotse face really was a sort of epic of tenacity. The big fear for any expedition was that you wouldn't get up in time before the monsoon.
Struggling with exhaustion, Lowe and his team fall behind schedule. With the expedition in the balance, Hunt climbs up to Lowe.
There was something slightly mischievous sometimes about George Lowe's filming because he sort of liked to show people, you know, in desperate straits. Here was Hunt coming up to chivvy him along and he's saying, you know, actually, look, you're exhausted, you know. You can just see that look on his face, you know, George, stop filming.
To break the deadlock on Lhotse, Hunt orders the use of some of the expedition's precious oxygen. The reinvigorated team complete their task, and supplies are ferried up to the South Col, the jumping-off point for the summit.
This was the big carry. This is a long chain of Sherpa porters carrying supplies up, oxygen, tents, food, to the South Col.
The moment has come for the assault team to leave to the higher camps. Hunt selects the 2 climbers he feels are strongest and best acclimatized. They are a summit team unlike any the British have sent before. One is a New Zealander, Edmund Hillary, and the other a Sherpa, Tenzing Norgay. They leave for the highest camp and the summit attempt. But this is where the filming stops.
At the last minute, Ed Hillary said, all right, go through your rucksacks, boys, and get rid of anything which is non-essential. And one of those non-essential things turned out to be the film camera. And so even though George Low went up to the high camp, he didn't film it.
Out of sight of the cameras, Hillary and Tenzing will have a hidden advantage on their summit attempt. A crucial scientific edge provided by the expedition's physiologist, Griffith Pugh.
About 20 years ago, I interviewed most of the team who were still alive then, and when I went to see the doctor, well, he's a surgeon, Michael Ward, the first thing he said to me, the most important person, the man who really made Everest a success in '53 was Griffith Pugh.
Griffith Pugh had studied the physiological reasons why previous Everest expeditions had failed. As Hillary and Tenzing began their final climb, they were using oxygen sets with double the flow rate of previous designs. This was thanks to Pugh's research into why previous oxygen sets had not been effective.
The sets had been developed from high altitude flying, and Griffith realised absolutely immediately that pilots are sitting in their cockpits not carrying the sets, whereas climbers are taking strenuous exercise. So if pilots need 2 to 2.5 litres of oxygen, it's obvious that climbers must need much more to get any benefit.
190,000 litres of bottled oxygen were taken to Everest by the British, 4 times as many as any previous expedition. Along with oxygen, the other fundamental advantage Pugh gave Hillary and Tenzing was equipment to melt large quantities of snow into water.
What Griffith realised was, apart from sweating and evaporation, climbers also lose water because they breathe out hot, wet air, and they breathe in dry mountain air. So they lose water from their lungs.
In 1952, the Swiss had been reduced to melting snow over a candle for water at their highest camp. When Hillary and Norgay became the first men to stand on the summit of Everest on the 29th of May 1953, Hillary was so well hydrated that he was forced to answer the call of nature.
Hillary talking about having a pee on the summit.
Yes, he had to have a pee on the summit. Yes, good point, yes.
I mean, that's incredible, because he's so well hydrated. I mean, you cannot overstate the importance of that issue.
The day after Hillary and Tenzing summited the mountain, cameras at the lower camps spot 3 figures returning. It's the 2 climbers, along with George Low. No one knows if the mountain has been climbed.
This is kind of, one of the most famous scenes in mountaineering film. And what makes it so great is it is spontaneous.
Hunt doesn't know. Can you imagine? He's the expedition leader and he doesn't know they've summited.
And all of a sudden, George is at the front of the rope, starts putting his thumb in the air and pointing to the summit with his ice axe, and we've done it.
Hunt leaps on Hillary and just leaps on Tenzing.
And you get to see the relief. What a wonderful piece of filming.
The highest mountain in the world has been climbed. The timing was impeccable. News was rushed back to Britain on the day of Queen Elizabeth's coronation.
This thing turned into something which nobody could have predicted. If the fact of these things coming together at the same time sort of turbocharged the expedition, and it was all over the newspapers all over the world.
The film was released with the triumphant title, The Conquest of Everest. George Lowe's gun camera photography brought home the thrill and danger of high-altitude mountaineering like never before. A stirring commentary ramped up the heroics.
Hillary and Tenzing stood on the summit of Everest. The top of the world has been reached.
It was a blockbuster success.
This was the story of the moment, and everything about Everest was selling in enormous numbers.
The film's climactic image was the summit photograph of Tenzing Norgay, a Sherpa, flying the flags not just of Britain, but of the United Nations, Nepal, and India. It was a story for a new Britain, no longer the head of an empire, but a new Commonwealth.
This was the period where Britain was trying to sell the idea of the Commonwealth, and so they liked the fact that this was a sort of a rainbow coalition. Well, the Foreign Office occasionally sponsored shows of the film in abroad. They certainly saw it as British propaganda.
It's their attempt to say, this is Britishness today. It's not just white. It includes all the peoples of the Queen's dominions and territories and so forth.
Britain had taken the ultimate prize in international mountaineering. But it had only returned with still photographs of the summiteers. There was still prestige to be found among the 12 remaining 8,000ers, including being the first to film from one of their peaks. The same year Britain climbed Everest, the Germans and Austrians returned to Nanga Parbat. The expedition film was German propaganda of a new sort. Not to promote Nazi ideals, but the fruits of the post-war German economic miracle.
It depicts tents made by Deuter, it depicts Löwenbräu beer, it depicts communications devices by Telefunken, and so on. A strategy that nowadays is very common, and that's called product placement.
The flag the Germans took with them to the summit was the flag of Pakistan.
But it wasn't the German flag, and it was not the Austrian flag, so a clear dissociation from previous nationalistically tainted events.
As the climbers leave for their summit attempt, like the British on Everest, the cameras can go no higher. This wasn't going to stop the filmmakers from visualizing the climb's finale.
When it came to making the movie, they did something which nobody else had done, which is they reconstructed it. What's interesting is that it wasn't accurate. Hermann Buhl famously crawled to the summit of Nanga Parbat on his hands and knees, fueled by amphetamines, totally exhausted. In the movie, you see this rather nice, steady progress of this guy with his ski poles silhouetted against the sun.
The film was made by Hans Ertl, a veteran cameraman of pre-war German mountain films and a former lover of Leni Riefenstahl.
Hans Ertl had learned his craft from the father of the German mountain film, Dr. Arnold Funk. A lot of play between mountain and light and shadow. It's the filmic language of the mountain film that Hans Ertl was trained in.
While German mountaineering had thrown off its pre-war political associations, German filmmakers were still enthralled to the aesthetic of the 1930s. German success on Nanga Parbat was followed a year later by an Italian expedition to K2, the second highest of the 8,000-meter peaks. The Italians wanted to outdo the British on Everest. K2, they said, was the Himalayas' most difficult peak. And they were determined to not only reach the summit, but to film it.
They knew from the beginning they were going to make a movie. And the thing that the summiters wanted to do, in particular Achille Compagnoni, was to film on the summit.
The Italian government had seen the prestige Britain had taken from Everest and financed the biggest, most expensive expedition ever. Over 700 men helped get the Italian climbers to the summit. These are the first ever moving images from the peak of an 8,000-meter mountain.
You don't see very much. It looks pretty dark. They look very cold. It looks pretty miserable. But this is it. This is the real McCoy.
Lead climber Achille Compagnone removed his glove to operate the camera and lost 2 fingers to frostbite. But these were the all-important images the Italians had come for.
When the film was sold, this was very much part of it. You've seen Everest, you've seen the film on Nanga Parbat, you've seen the Annapurna film, but now we're actually going to give you some footage of what it's like on the top of an 8,000-metre peak.
The expedition's success was heralded as a moment of national healing for a country still confronting its fascist past.
The welcome the Italians got as they came off the boat, having climbed K2, was just staggering. I mean, here was something that was spirited and joyful with a little bit of danger, and they were leading the world, and that meant a great deal, I think.
After Everest and K2, the floodgates opened in the Himalayas. Improved technology and physiology meant that by the end of the 1950s, all but one of the 14 8,000-metre peaks had been climbed. And in 1963, the Americans did what the British could not: brought back film from the summit of the highest, Everest. The cameras followed an historic traverse of the mountain, ascending one route and descending another. But for the superpowers, mountaineering's prestige was fading.
The Americans climbed Everest in 1963. They did it brilliantly, fated by Kennedy. But, there was a sense, well, that's that. We've done that. Now let's get on with this going to the moon thing, because that's going to be the next big thing.
Even Everest paled in comparison to the new frontier of exploration. And when in 1964 a Chinese team climbed the last of the 8,000ers, Shishapangma, the curtain fell on the epic era of mountaineering. Today, more people climb mountains than ever. But the symbolic power of the 14 great 8,000ers is forgotten.
The difference between modern mountaineering and the mountaineering from the 20s to the end of the 1950s, early 60s, is that in those days it was a national event. People were able to get funding to go to big mountains by saying, this is all about our country, planting our flag on the top. They were seen in this bigger nationalistic context. That has gone now.
And in the digital era, film and filmmaking no longer plays the key role it once did.
Nowadays, everyone thinks he or she is a filmmaker, because everyone can take film on a camera this big.
You don't take out an ice axe and unravel some flags. When you climb a mountain now, you want a mobile phone, you take a selfie, and then you instantly whiz it back to your family at home.
Tragedy strikes 2 of the finest climbers of their time as the Epic of Everest charts Mallory and Irvine's ill-fated expedition in just a moment here on BBC4. And then the climbing continues at 11:25 as we don the crampons and prepare to get stuck in to the Eiger's Wall of Death. Stay with us.